Hey there, kiddos. Kiddos. It's like something I would call my kids. I know you're all grown adults, but you could be a kiddo at heart because that's super cool and trending, according to Carrie. Always stay playful. Playful keeps you young at heart. Today is World Mental Health Day, I believe is what they call it. And when I was extremely active in counseling centers and working in an intensive outpatient program, these days would be a pretty big deal. I think every day should be Mental Health Day because I think we always have to tend to our mental and emotional well-being, but that's just me. But it's another beautiful fall day here in Brevard, and I just wanted to share a couple of things. We have this idea in our head of what emotional instability looks like, or we make things that are normal. And again, we could go to like Gabor Mate's myth of normal, like what is normal? But just for the sake of argument, society very much identifies what is normal and what's not. Like we have an idea of what's right and what's wrong, right? So, although I agree with Gabor, like the myth of normal, what is really normal, we could dissect that for days. But we have this idea in our heads of if, somebody says like, I'm having suicidal thoughts, so many people, the real reason why a lot of people don't self-disclose that information is because you're shipped off to a mental institution. You're taken to a mental hospital and they treat you like you are, a terrible person. And I can't tell you how insanely common it is for people to have a suicidal thought or two in their lifetime. This is not uncommon. Perhaps you'd have to be submerged in the mental health field to see this. And of course, we're seeing an uptick in suicidal ideation, attempts of suicide. And I know this is a very tender subject, but it's a subject that's close to my heart. And in honor of today, I would like to hopefully dispel some stigma. And I will talk about my own personal experience with this. I think Tim Ferriss even posted something. It's kind of one of my pet peeves. An everyday average person like me would get so much crap for self-disclosing. But like Taylor Tomlinson, who's this famous comedian, and she outwardly talks about being bipolar all the time, and she just gets this outpouring of like, oh my god, you're like our mental health hero. And people will rush to Tim Ferriss and try to kiss all his boo-boos because once upon a time he thought about taking his life, because they're famous and they're popular. And then, the rest of those same people would turn like a turncoat on an average everyday person like me and be super judgmental. And I have a big problem with that. We shouldn't be cheerleading for all of these famous people because they had hardship. And I don't begrudge them for being famous, but I'm just saying, like, what about the everyday average person that's struggling with their mental health? Why are we not patting them on the back? Why are we not cheerleading for them? I once had somebody say, Carrie, you're always cheering for the underdog because you were the underdog. Well, that may very well be, but we don't ever turn our backs on the everyday average person that makes up the bulk of the American population. That's my tangent for this video. There might be another one. So when I was about 16, I cannot tell you exactly what age I was because this is extremely blurry. Now, mind you, the highest rate of successful death by suicide, if we want to be politically correct, which who wants to be politically correct these days, right? If you're like me and you're that like little PC rebel, but I do understand what they're saying. Because of the stigma of suicide, it is, like dying of cancer. So they say death by suicide instead of making it so abhorrent, like, oh, that person, took their own life. A lot went on in the underbelly of all of that. Nobody just decides to go do these crazy things to take their own life. That is, it's not as abrupt of a decision as you think it is. And so when I was 16, roundabout, for me, I've said this before, I want to make this clear because I have a sister who's living and I will never speak for her. Every single person in the house is having their own very personal, unique experience of the family dynamic. It is very important to understand that. No one will ever be in agreement on what went on in their home. For me, my home was filled with a lot of love and a lot of hurt and a lot of pain and a lot of volatility and a lot of chaos, which made it confusing because it was like, well, what is really love? And I identified love with a lot of pain and a lot of angst because of what was going on in my household, because there was addiction and there was anger issues and there were people who could not communicate. You were either yelling or you were being stonewalled. There was silence or there was screaming. There was not a lot of in between. There was not a lot of emotional maturity and intelligence. I do not begrudge anyone in my family for this. They were not given the tools. That's just that. I mean, it's that simple. It's that easy. And both of my parents grew up in volatile households with a shit ton of addiction. Alcoholism was pretty much the main component there. And nobody knew how to fight fair. I've said this before. Fighting is okay. Can you fight fair? Because there is a difference. We want to stay above the belt, if we can. So when I was 16, I swallowed a bottle of pills. Now, when I say pills, they were Tylenol PMs. Clearly, I was someone who did not actually want to take my life. By the way, it is very common for women to attempt to take their lives swallowing pills. The highest rate of death by suicide right now in America is white males. This is terrifying. The statistics are terrifying. And they're older. They're like middle-aged, which is troublesome and sad. And I saw this working in the intensive outpatient program. We had a ton of people that were actively suicidal. And it was my first experience of sitting in a clinical setting at a desk and somebody sitting across from me and saying, I'm going to take my life tonight. And it was like, oh my gosh, take a deep breath. Okay. I can handle this. And I think I did a pretty good job. And unfortunately, they could not ever tell me what happened to that client because I was not a licensed counselor. I think about him all the time. And I pray for him all the time, whether he's here or not, because he taught me a lot. I learned a lot from this gentleman. I do not judge people who think about taking their life. I do not judge people who've attempted to take their life. Not just because of my personal experience. We have to understand that people are in an enormous amount of pain to do this. This is not an act of selfishness, no matter how you perceive it. This person truly believes that everybody would be better off without them. There is deep-seated complex trauma at the heart of this. And most of the time, there's a lot of contemplation. And I was taking Tylenol PMs to help me fall asleep at night. I had terrible insomnia at this point in my life. Life felt very hard. I felt very alone. I did not have parents that I could go to and say I'm struggling. I was 99.9% sure that if I disclosed, especially my father, probably would have had me shipped off to a mental institution. I just didn't trust him and his response. And when I tell you the second story, I pretty much now know that I was right over what would have been received with. So I swallowed the whole bottle, prayed that I would not wake up the next day. You can say that it was an act of cowardice. I mean, whatever you want to say, I'm totally prepared for the comments, if there are any, because I've already had it live in person with people like, I can't believe you admitted that you tried, you wanted to take your life. Like, I thought you were so put together. It's, if you think all these people in leadership are not so deeply inherently flawed, then you're extremely naive. I will tell you that. I met Deepak Chopra in person and he was a complete asshole. So, we are so disillusioned. I'm not a starstruck person, but so many people are so disillusioned and just have all of these people up on a pedestal. Please stop doing that. They're going to fall off really quick. But anyway, I was not successful. I'm very glad I was not successful. I never told anybody for a really long time. Like, I'm talking not until in my 40s. I've been in therapy in and out since I've been 13 years old, and I've never even told a clinician this until I was in my late 30s or early 40s. And I just remember waking up and being like really disappointed. And then as time went on, like, okay, I really understand that I didn't want to do that, and I'm here for a reason. And it never happened again. For me, it never happened again. And so that's my brief story. I could tell you I was in a lot of emotional pain. I did not feel like I had the support, and I did not feel like I had the tools. I knew that my mother loved me deeply, and a lot of it was wanting to stay and be with my mom. Now, I've talked a little bit about generational trauma and how cycles repeat. So fast forward to my oldest daughter. And I'm not going to go deep into this because I won't make it through the video. But when she was, I think she was 17. There's so much I want to say about this. My daughter is an amazing kid. The tears are going to start already. My daughter is an amazing kid. She was gifted. I'm not one of those moms, because I will put my kids in their place in 10 seconds flat. It is very important as a parent to be able to tell your kids when they're being a little shit. And I have no problem doing that. And I give my kids the grace and the ability to say to me, you know what, Mom, I don't like what you're saying or doing. So I decided to have, I had a very open relationship with my kids. But my daughter was gifted. Athletically, insanely gifted. Everything she touched seemingly turned to gold. She was racking up academic awards at a very, very young age. She was in all honors and high honors classes. She was an amazingly talented soccer player. My dad was a semi-pro soccer player. I was not. So I didn't know what to do with it. My ex-husband's sports were also not soccer related. So we kind of turned to my dad because, my dad was the soccer player. And, she picked up a ball at 2 and never put it down. And then in high school, she started playing basketball, and she was like pretty decent. And again, my ex-husband and I had never played that sport. And then she started lacrosse, and we had no experience with lacrosse. And she was like the rock star at lacrosse. And she was an amazing artist, and she played the violin, and her teacher begged her not to quit because the teacher said, I have never seen a kid pick up the violin and be so successful with this instrument. It's very difficult to learn. Now, you can imagine for my youngest, this was quite difficult because my youngest we called her the nonner as a joke, which in hindsight was probably hurtful, but she was not an athlete. So we just, that was my little nonner. And I was much more supportive of her than my ex-husband. My ex-husband really was that kind of dad that wanted to hardcore athletes. And he tried to make Sarah an athlete while we were married. And when we got divorced, I really put the kibosh on it. I said, you just have to understand that she's musically gifted, and she had some artistic, a little artistic creative side, and she was my dancer, and she was a phenomenal dancer. And I thankfully was a dancer for a long time too, so I had experience with that. And music, I played a couple instruments. So Sarah really felt like she was living in the shadow of her sister, and that was very difficult because Devin got a lot of attention. This was also a kid who was the runner-up to the homecoming queen. It was just, she was that kind of kid, and the pressure got to her. And there was a collapse, and she had a really hard time. I was teaching at that time in the high school as a substitute teacher, and because I worked multiple jobs, I didn't want to be roped into to teaching full time, and I didn't love everything going on in the classroom. I've been very honest and upfront about how I feel about that stuff. Just not for me, if everybody's a teacher in a public school system, you're heroic. It's very difficult nowadays, especially to be a teacher. I'm not knocking it. It just wasn't, for my personality and constitution. So I was subbing in the high school. So both my daughters were in the high school, and I would hear the coaches go up to her and say, you're going to win the game for us tonight, with soccer. They had a lot riding on her. They put way too much pressure on her. Her basketball coach did the same thing. Lacrosse was a little bit more lenient with her because there were other really good girls on the team that excelled. And don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that there weren't any players on the soccer team that were as good as Devin. But for whatever reason, they had her shoulder a lot of that responsibility. And I still am trying to live this down. Nothing really gets past me. So I'm not sure why it took me so long to understand what was happening. But months and months had gone by, and the kids were putting vodka, pure vodka, in their water bottles, their little Poland Spring water bottles, and drinking pure vodka during class time in school. I had noticed a change in behavior. You know, I was a single mom. I didn't have a lot of support. I was working I never worked less than 2 to 3 jobs to make ends meet and provide. And I just didn't see it. Maybe some of her friends were trying to tell me and I wasn't getting it. I don't know. Again, it was all a blur. But she went to the Belmar St. Patrick's Day parade. And there were some times that I was working nights catering. And I was home this night. And by the grace of God, I had my phone, the sound turned off. I normally had the sound turned off on my phone. And somehow it rang. And it could only be God. And I got the call that Devin was in the hospital and they didn't know if she was going to make it. And I had to get there. And it was Jersey Shore Medical in Neptune, not Brick Hospital, which was closer to me. And that's all I knew. And that's all they would tell me. And then my ex-husband called me and said, you have to get here. It's horrible. He was crying. And I got there and it was a nightmare. I've never witnessed anything like this before. It's a miracle that they found her. If the police officers did not find her, my daughter would not have survived. The amount of alcohol in her was obscene. Nobody knows how she survived. Thankfully, I had a cop championing for my daughter because he also, based on her behavior, was like, there's something else in her. And they had tested her for drugs because they were convinced that she took something and nothing else was coming up. And the cop and I both agreed that she was roofied. They found her face down in a parking lot behind a convenience store on a side street in Neptune that was not well traveled. And cops sometimes went back there because drug deals would go down. And if they didn't find her, they said she wouldn't have made it. It was essentially an attempt on her own life. I think she was basically trying to drink herself to death. And that was happening slowly under my nose, and I didn't see it. I can't tell you what a failure I felt like as a mom. I felt like I should have known. She was also cutting, and she wore long sleeves all the time. And I kept saying to her, why are you always in long sleeves? I just was in such survival mode, and I felt like I had so much on my plate and so much to be concerned with that I didn't even think to pull my kids' sleeves up to see the marks. And my poor little Sarah knew exactly what was going on with all of this, the drinking vodka, the arms, the marks on her arms, the cutting. And Devin made her promise she wouldn't tell me, and Sarah wanted to be loyal, and I didn't understand at that time how much babysitting my youngest daughter was doing and caretaking, which was not her responsibility. And so when I got to the hospital, my ex-husband was a mess, and my daughter and my ex-husband did not get along. And she was not saying very nice things to him under the influence, which I'm sure was very embarrassing for him. And he couldn't handle it, and he left the hospital. So now I was left at the hospital by myself. And I did it. They didn't know if she was going to make it. And I don't know why I did this, but I am very connected to certain elements and things that I just can't explain to you in the spiritual realm. I consider myself very practical and pragmatic and grounded and very down to earth. But something in me knew that this was some form of a spiritual crisis. And my daughter was either going to make the decision to transition over or stay. And so everyone in the hospital hated me. I had nurses screaming in my face that if my daughter was 18 years old, they would have kicked me out. I only had one nurse who came up to me and rubbed my back and said, "You are a rock star, stick to your guns, you're an amazing mom, and you're doing the right thing." But all the other nurses were very, very aggravated and angry with me, and some of the doctors were too. So they wanted to give her Haldol, which is an antipsychotic. She basically was in complete psychosis. They had her in a straitjacket. She was very abusive to the staff, and again, was not in her right mind. And I agree with the police officer. I've never seen behavior like this before. This was not my daughter. She was unrecognizable. And at one point she looked at me and said, "The devil has me, Mom. The devil he's after me and he's got me." So something was very, very often wrong about this whole situation. And so I don't know why, but I started playing shamanic drumming. And I'd worked with a shaman for years, and I felt like that work with this woman prepared me for this moment. Because I never understood why I was so attracted to shamanism. And I played the drumming, and I kept praying and talking to her and praying to Jesus. Like, I called every angel, Archangel Michael, God, Jesus, Mother Mary, every being of light into that room. And again, it was like a possession. I don't know how to explain this, but she would come out of it and talk to me normal and tell me she was so sorry and how much she loved me. And then she would zip back into this like possession and act like a crazy person. I mean, she bit me, I was bleeding, my whole arm blew up. It was like nothing I've ever experienced before. And I've never told this story before because we were so judged. We came out of this with no support. She lost every friend. Nobody called her. Nobody checked on her. Not one mother reached out to me. It was like we were lepers in the town of Point Pleasant. It was heartbreaking. And to watch my daughter suffer in that way as part of her recovery with no friend or support in sight, people that were supposed to love and care about her, was extremely disheartening. And so I hesitated to ever disclose this story, really because I just don't want to hear the nonsense that comes out of people's mouths. I really don't. The reason why I would not give permission for her to be pumped with Haldol is because we had no idea what was in my daughter's system. It is a myth that if you're roofied, it'll come up in your blood work. And the cop kept trying to say that to the nurses and the doctors. You can absolutely be roofied, and whatever those drugs are, they might not show up in the blood work. So I was so petrified that they would pump her with Haldol to break the psychosis and she wouldn't make it through the dose because her system was so taxed. There was so much alcohol in her. Not one friend knew where she was, by the way, that night. Nobody knew what happened to her. Nobody knew where she went. Way to stick together, kids. Please don't do that to your friends. If you're a young person watching this, please don't do that to your friends. How could my daughter get lost in a shuffle of a dozen or more kids is beyond me. I don't understand that. So, finally, I said, put me on the phone with the psychiatrist on duty. And I said, I will agree to the Haldol if you promise me you will dose her with a children's dose. And they said, Miss Holshoe, it's not going to do the trick. Like, you don't know what you're talking about. I said, no, I do. I do. And I'm adamant that you give her a pediatric dose. And if it doesn't work, we'll dose her again. Because 2 pediatric doses, I don't think still would have equated the amount of milligrams they were going to give her for an adult dose. So they did it, and it worked. Because I knew. Because I'm intuitive and perceptive, and I knew, and I trusted myself. I was so confident in myself throughout this, even though everything inside of me wanted to fall apart. Because of course I wanted my kid to live. So they gave her the Haldol, and she went night-night. And the doctor said to me, she will not remember anything. Don't give her detail. Let her just be in denial of all of this. It's better for her. It's better for her brain. But just remember, she's going to wake up. She's probably going to say, what happened to your arm? it's your decision, but you don't have to tell her what happened. And they kept coming and taking her vitals, and it was about 3 a.m, and I was cuddled in bed with her. She scared the hell out of me. She literally jumped up and sat up, and she looked at me and she said, "I'm starving." And I was like, never so happy to hear those words. And I said, "You must be parched. You must be so thirsty." And she ate. We got her food. She drank. And as we were waiting for the food, her next sentence was, "They left me." She remembered everything. The doctors couldn't believe it. They couldn't believe it. She remembered everything from soup to nuts. And there were a lot of tears. The battle was not won and over, and I knew that instinctually and intuitively. And when I got in the car, she was discharged a day or two later. And when we got in the car, I called my father. And I said, "Guess who's," because the first person I called was my dad, bawling my eyes out. Of course he was distraught. So when I called him the next day or 2 days later and I said, "Guess who I have on speakerphone?" He went at her with venom. "You're weak. We're so disappointed in you. I can't believe you did that to your mother. I thought you were strong. Only weak people want to take their lives." He basically told her off, sent her into a fit of complete hyperventilation. And I said, "Oh, that's why when I was 16, I didn't tell my family anything." Because, when you know. Parents wonder why. Well, I don't know why my kid didn't say anything. It's probably because you're not approachable. I mean, parents, it's our job to take a really good hard look at ourselves and how we're parenting and the way that we are with our children, because there's a reason for it. It's not always because you're of your kids. Sometimes it's really crappy parenting. And so that was devastating for me and for my daughter. And this was a 2-year battle. This went on for 2 years, on and off. I threw myself into a master's program. This is what made me want to become a mental health counselor. I was so determined to want to help other young people in this situation because it was so heartbreaking. There was a lot more that went into this that I'm not comfortable talking about. I have no desire to throw my ex-husband under the bus, but there was, he did have a big responsibility in all of this, behaviors and actions with this particular daughter, which was not helpful. And when a child is afraid of a parent, and when a child feels unloved and unsupported by a parent, there are repercussions. And so I'm not laying all the blame on him, but that was a big part of the situation. And so when I was actively pursuing my master's, I came across an article that a woman wrote, and it was called something like passive suicidal ideation. And I couldn't understand. And thank gosh, after this, my daughter was so open with me about, like, I just don't want to be here. I just don't want to live. And I don't know what to tell you. And, imagine living on edge as a parent. And if you're watching this and you've endured this, my heart breaks for you. And if you lost a child this way to death by suicide, I am so deeply sorry. Because I just didn't know if I was going to make it through. I just kept saying to God, "Are you sure I'm supposed to be signed up for this? Like, are you sure you trust me enough to be strong enough to endure this?" Because I've never felt so emotionally unstable and distraught in my whole life. And I felt like my daughter's life was in my hands. And every day she would say, I just don't want to be here. And I read this article by this woman, and I thought, oh my gosh, this is my daughter. And basically what the article went on to say is that this woman just did not have an attachment to being alive. She just didn't have attachment to life. She was very detached, and like, if I die tomorrow, I die tomorrow. And it was a very fascinating article. of this woman just felt like she was here but not here, and she didn't actively want to take her life, but if, like, she took her last breath in the next second, she would be fine with that. And that's kind of what my daughter was describing to me, and I didn't understand it. And then I read this article and it was helpful. And then I learned so much being in school, and one of my professors was our suicide prevention and postvention specialist. And I would sit, she became a counselor because she almost lost her son to death by suicide. And so she was so helpful. And she said to me one day, you need to help your daughter find a reason to live. And I thought, yeah, okay. Yeah, let's get to the heart of that. And I went home with renewed hope, and I said to my daughter, well, what would be reasons for you wanting to be here? And she said, I'm only here because of you. I'm only going to stay here because of you, Mom, because I know it would destroy you if I did it. You want to talk about pressure? I mean, God, I think I cried for days, and I was just petrified. What if I say the wrong thing? What if I do the wrong thing? What if I push my own kid off the edge? It was probably the most difficult 2 years of my life. We did do medication. It did happen again. There were 2 hospitalizations after that from alcohol. A lot of people think this is an excuse, but please do your own research on this. Your brain can literally be allergic to alcohol. And I kept telling my daughter this. And again, when you're a parent saying something, it goes in one ear and out the other. And I finally got her in the hands of a psychiatrist who was born and raised in France and was in America practicing psychiatric medicine, psychiatry. There you go, Carrie. And he said, your mom is right, Devin. Your brain is outright allergic to alcohol, and you cannot drink ever again. Ever again, if you want to live. And then I thought, oh God, she now knows that all she has to do is just drink maybe a little bit more than she does, and that's it. But every time she would drink, she would go into psychosis. So there were 3 hospitalizations. Very embarrassing and invasive things happen. The way that they treat these people is abhorrent. I really don't have a tolerance for it. It's where I fall in love more and more with Gabor Mate and the things that he talks about. We should not be treating people with mental health issues in this way. It's not helpful. It's not helpful. Maybe I'll talk more about that another time. I don't want this video to run too much longer, but I did demand that my daughter do 30 days. So this was still when she was 17. No, I'm sorry. This was when she was 18. And she did do 30 days. She was 18. She could have said no. And I said, I will go with a Florida rehab and have them fly out and take you against your will, which was not something I was really going to do. But I was using this as a threat. And she's really not the kid where stuff like that worked. But I was so desperate. So I found a local rehab that had excellent ratings. And there's a lot of problems with rehab. That's like another thing I can talk about another time. But I drove her down. She did the full 30 days. She called me crying a lot. Again, if you're a parent and you've gone through this, my heart is with you, and you know how damn difficult this is. It was so hard for me not to go there and say, I'm going to rescue you from this. But everything in me understood that she had to feel what she was feeling, and she had to suffer the consequences of really poor choices and behavior. Even though I understood why she was acting out, even though I had a better understanding of the suicidal ideation, she needed consequences and she needed tools. And the good thing was that one day she called me up and said, you know, Mom, my life isn't as bad as I thought it was, and I'm in much better standing than a lot of these people here. And believe me, I saw that upon check-in. There were people in way worse states than her. But what this did for me professionally is I became a recovery coach, and I worked with families in the same situation. I'm a big believer, when in need, do a good deed. I loved working with these families. I never talked about my own personal situation. I never self-disclosed. But what I endured with my oldest daughter gave me the tools to help other people. And I didn't know what to do with my pain and grief. I just knew that I was raised in a house where you give it back. You become of service. This was volunteer. I wasn't getting paid for this. And so a couple days a week, they would give me X amount of clients. And this was heartbreaking. This was a heartbreak that I can't describe to anybody. And one of my daughter's friends endured this. And again, I'm not saying this to blow up my daughter as if like, oh my God, look at my kid, she's so great. Because we are all inherently flawed. And I never raised my kids to be cocky or arrogant. But she went through this with a friend, and a friend tried to take her life, and she was almost successful. And my daughter was one of the first people at that girl's door with a card and flowers and balloons and a gift. And the fact that nobody showed up for my kid, and not one mom reached out to me and said, are you okay? Is there anything I could do? Was horrific. There was no excuse for that. I don't know why we were so left in the dark. But that really impacted my daughter especially. And to watch my kids suffer even more with the lack of support was just terrible. Her best friend for years and years and years said, I'm going to come over the day she got out of the hospital. Called her hours later. I said, where is Jennifer? And she said, she's not coming. She went to the gym. And my daughter never heard from that girl again. Please don't do this to people in that situation. The best thing that you could say to somebody if you don't have the tools is, this is not my scope of practice. This is way over my head. I don't have the tools, but I'm here for you and I want to support you. And I'm going to figure out a way to support you, or I'm going to help you find the help that you need. But don't ever abandon somebody in this situation, especially the mom, for the love of God. It was just heartbreaking. And I wound up moving out of the town eventually because it was like, this is crap. But we got through it, and she's here. She's 23 years old. There are still some struggles with anxiety and depression, which I think a lot of us are dealing with, and I think it's the sign of the times. I think it's a lot of social media for these younger kids. But she's getting back on track. And I'm so grateful she's here. I don't take a single day of having my kids in this world for granted anymore. And a lot of people questioned why I left. And how could you leave your kids, period, never mind your oldest daughter. My job is to make my kids as self-reliant and self-sufficient and independent as possible. My kids know that I'm always there for them. But I had to learn to let my kids suffer the consequences of their behavior and their actions. And there is nothing you could do as a parent to keep your kids from doing certain things. And it sounds harsh saying that. It sounds harsh to my own ears coming out of my mouth, but I actually could not save my daughter. And I was convinced for a long time that I could, but it wasn't my job. My job was to support her, but I couldn't save her. And the distance has been good for us in one way and hard on us in another way. But the time came in my life where I had to do something for myself after being in a caretaker role since I was a young kid and just having very unique situations in my home and living my life and making a lot of decisions to please other people and make other people happy. And I'm a car ride away, and I promised my kids that if they ever called or texted me and say, we need you, I would be there, and I will always uphold that promise. So for World Mental Health Day, if you are someone that has someone in your life struggling, whether it's with suicide or anxiety, depression, bipolar, schizophrenia, I'm not really hopped up and big into the labeling. I think we over-label. And there are a lot of people that make a ton of money off of these labels. And I will tell you that during my daughter's crisis, half of her senior class was being sent to the same center in Brick, New Jersey called Gen Psych, seeing the same psychiatrist, being diagnosed with the same 3 to 4 things, and all be putting on the same meds. And that's just not even possible. It's not even possible for somebody, like, it's not all one size fits all. You can't all be bipolar. You can't all be schizophrenic. You can't all have, ADHD. You can't all have a generalized anxiety. And that's where psychiatry fails. I mean, the session was super quick, and when she went for her refills on prescription, she was literally in and out. There were no questions, there was no depth, there was no substance, there was no nothing. So again, if you are someone who's endured this, I'm so sorry. Thank you for staying with me throughout this video. I'm actually really proud of myself that I didn't break down any more than that. It's been a long time, but the memories are really fresh. Oh, and by the way, after the drumming and the nurses hating me, like, are you kidding me that this girl's playing shamanic drumming? When my daughter slipped under from the haldol, I switched to very calming, relaxing music. And that's actually when the nurse came up to me and rubbed my back and said, "You did an amazing job, Mom." And she said, I agreed with all of your decisions. You really advocated and championed for your daughter. And as another FYI, before I sign off, the other 2 hospitalizations were after she was 18. Again, if you've been in this situation, you know how devastating this is. They cannot tell you anything. They don't even call you and tell you. My daughter called me and said, I'm in a mental hospital. It happened again. I drank. I went into psychosis. If she didn't call me, I wouldn't have known. When I called them back, they told me that they could not confirm nor deny if my daughter was there. And then the third time that it happened, somebody called me to let me know that was in her circle at that time. So we're living in really crazy times. A lot of parents are being stripped of their rights. I don't know when we decided that kids at 18 are full-blown adults and a parent doesn't need to know if their life is in danger. I think this is batshit crazy, especially when they legally aren't supposed to be drinking until 21. But this is where we're at. And I'm not looking for sympathy at all whatsoever. None. Comment what you will, but I ask you to maintain the integrity and the ethics of being as kind of a person as you are, because parents in my situation, family members in my situation, really don't need to hear all the crap or your harsh opinions about what you think about this. My daughter's a good kid, and she was in a bad way, and it happens, and it's happening more and more. And part of my business model and why I do what I do and why I am so insanely passionate about getting the kids outside in nature and away from technology is to really help combat this heightened sense of like self-implosion among our youth, where they've really lost a deep sense of self. And how could this not be happening with social media and AI and filtering your pictures so that you look like somebody that you're really not, because you can't even accept how you look, because there's so much pressure to be all, be all of it and do all of it. And there's just a lot that these kids are bumping up against that we really just didn't have to contend with. And so thank you for listening. If you've listened to this whole video, go out in nature today for World Mental Health Day or whatever they're calling it. Get outside, breathe a little bit of fresh air, hug your loved ones, and try not to be so judgmental and hard and harsh on people that you know who've endured this. Even if you don't understand it, you don't need to understand it. You just need to be a good, supportive, loving friend and family member. Take care.